But before we go there, to go back to something earlier again, this whole question of objectivity, one of, I think, the truly remarkable things that you've been prepared to do, which we all need to learn from, was that you said once that perhaps we'd overdone the 3 cheers version of our history, where we clapped everything that we'd achieved, we talked about our colonial days without regard for the downside. It was all about how clever we'd been. Then we had the sort of reaction that wanted to describe us as horrendous sort of sons and daughters of oppressive colonialists from the other side of the world. That became, I think you termed the expression, the black armband view of history. And you said that we need to meet somewhere sensibly in the middle. Perhaps we needed a correction, but that the correction, it turns out to be more prejudiced and more dangerous than the original that we were trying to break free of.
Yes, I said that in a lecture at Sydney University, I think in 1992. I was brought up in the 3 cheers view of Australian history, that it was one of the great success stories of the world, but there's very little you could criticise. But that was born, that theory was born in many ways of the country being at war. You have to maintain the morale of the country. You have to say this is a great country we're defending, and we had the First World War, 1914-18. Then the 20 years that were strongly influenced by that war. Then we had the Second World War. You just have to maintain morale, and people are proud of a country if they give up, if they have to risk their life defending it. And then came the period, perhaps from the 1970s onwards, when people said the failings in Australia are much more conspicuous, much more important than the successes. And they said, look at the way we've treated Aborigines. Well, of course, there was much at fault in treating Aborigines, but at the same time, there was a tendency to glorify Aboriginal society and to say that they lived in peace with one another. Well, of course, the evidence is overwhelmingly against that. They're human beings, and they fought. And people like to say, well, they had a wonderful sense of kinship. Well, that's true, but a man could have 10 or 20 wives in Aboriginal society. That's not quite kinship by a modern definition. So there's great virtues in Aboriginal society. We moved to the situation where we said our society is infinitely inferior to an Aboriginal society. I don't accept that. Likewise, people said, look what we've done to the environment. Well, true, we've often failed in being custodians of the environment, but that's true of every country in the world over history. Has not been a faithful custodian of the environment. The environment has to be changed in order to support a larger and larger population. So I thought we moved to a gloomy view of Australian history from perhaps a view that was too optimistic. And that gloomy view is now extremely powerful, and it dominates the primary schools, yes, which are the great educators. No matter what people say, universities are not the great educators in Australia. The primary schools are. And the primary schools are homes of the black armband.
Very
view
interesting.
Of history.
It's a very interesting insight.
That's my view.
It's something for us to really think about. Those formative years. Just as we also know, of course, that the very early years before you even started a preschool are incredibly important, and yet often we behave as though they're not, I think. But let's drill into that a bit more.
Did you go to preschool?
I didn't. No, I didn't go into a classroom. People say it shows. I didn't go into a classroom until I was 9. I lived out in the middle of nowhere.
Yes, I don't suppose I would have gone on very well at preschool.
But to drill into this, one of the great problems we have, as Jonathan Haidt puts it, we now teach our children that life is a battle between good people and bad people. Well, we know that's nonsense. We're all a mixture. This lack of ability to hold things in suspension, we see it with the debate over Australia Day in a way. I mean, I can understand that Aboriginal people have deep grievances. I can understand that. But to move the date, my personal views, that'd be madness. Why not use the date to have a much more honest discussion about what happened? Don't lose the date, you may lose the discussion, would be my view. But to come back to something, I'd just like to...
It's taken us a very long while to accept Australia Day. Even mainstream Australian society has been slow to accept it. In Victoria, we didn't even call it Australia Day. We called it ANA Day when I was a child, and many parts of Australia didn't celebrate Australia Day. Now, every part of Australia in some way or other celebrates Australia Day, and that's a great achievement. It seems to me, when some success has been achieved, that you decide to throw it out. I mean, I think the big mistake is that the Aborigines don't use Australia Day to celebrate their own achievements. I mean, they say Captain Cook, we've got no time for Captain Cook. They say, well, our ancestors discovered Australia. Well, in a sense, that's true. Why don't they build one, and we build a monument to the early Aboriginal explorers and discoverers? Their attitude, I think, has become very negative, and if they want to criticise Australia Day, why not do something positive themselves?
Well, I agree. And if there are issues that they want to explore, we'll use the day to explore it, but let's do it in a sensible way. And what strikes me here, you see, is that in the area that I used to represent, there's an area called Mile Creek where a terrible massacre happened in the 1830s.
That's in your old electorate, isn't
it?
Mm-hmm.
And so I became very interested in the story. And it's been well researched now. And it was a horrendous thing, a bunch of, I think it's 10 or 11 stockmen, when most of the men were away, drove the women and children and the few remaining men that were in the camp at Mile Creek over a cliff. And it was terrible. Mm-hmm. Now,
and it's beyond dispute, a lot of that story.
It is. Mm-hmm. Now, but here's my point. We never tell the story without recognising the nobility of the white people who were aggrieved and insisted that those men be taken to trial, including the manager of the station. It was one of Henry Dangar, who was a famous landowner up there. His manager became aware of what had happened and courageously, it was very courageously, because his own life was in danger, he insisted that those men be brought to trial. Now, they were acquitted first time round, and people from the jury were heard to say things like, I'd never see a white man hanged for killing a black man. But there was a man called Plunkett who was, I can't remember his title, but effectively the Chief Justice of New South Wales at the time. He was a devout Catholic, as it happened, burning with indignation at this terrible miscarriage of justice, managed to force a second trial, and people were hung. So there's two sides to the story. There were people who were noble enough to insist on justice, and that's never told, or too rarely told. You see, history's never straightforward, is it? It's not a simple question of one grouping of people are perfect and another group of people are all bad. Mm. That's to deny the truth of human nature.
Mm-hmm. It's inevitable that Aboriginal leaders will be hostile to parts of Australian history, and it will go on for a long time, and there are a wide variety of things they're entitled to publicise, but at the same time, in the period where the Aborigines were believed to be maltreated, the average Australian was giving from their own pockets considerable sums of money. There were no welfare states to set up missions all around Australia. Now, the missions are out of favour, but the missions provided a welfare system for Aborigines which didn't exist in Australia for mainstream Australians. There was no welfare state in Australia in 1860 or 1880. In a bad time, you were, strictly speaking, in a depression. You were better off being an Aboriginal than being a white Australian. What did you do if you were a white Australian and you were unemployed? There were no social services. So that it was much more complex than we like to think. But at the same time, I respect the Aboriginal spokespeople, their leaders are entitled to draw attention to these grievances, but they should also draw attention to other things.
Well, I represented a lot of Aboriginals. I had more Aboriginals per, in percentage terms than almost any other electorate in Australia. Mm. And there was a very wide range of views. It was often very interesting to talk to Aboriginal people, particularly older ones. I remember an old lady at Walgett telling me how deeply she regretted the loss of their mission.
Yes.
Because she said she and her friends had been given a surprisingly good education. They'd been taught a lot about nutrition and hygiene and what have you, and she was deeply appreciative of it. And she regretted that her grandchildren particularly had not had the same opportunities she'd had. Now, you don't hear that perspective, and I think the point you and I are just making is that it's always much more complicated. And we often ascribe ill intent to people who have really been very well intentioned indeed.
Thank you for watching this episode. We appreciate your support. If you value vital conversations like this one, be sure to subscribe to the channel there and also click the notification bell to stay up to date with new releases.